Hello! In this tasting I'm going to be looking at a South Australian Shiraz. Particularly this is Jim Barry's Lodge Hill Shiraz, so it's from a single vineyard in the Clare Valley, and it's the 2022 vintage of that. Based in the Clare Valley, I guess Jim Barry is probably one of the defining wineries of the Clare region. Their flagship wine, the Armagh Shiraz, is probably one of the more critically acclaimed wines of the Clare Valley. They tend to specialise in making Shiraz and Riesling. However, amongst other varieties they produce are Cabernet Sauvignon, Grenache, and also quite an interesting Assyrtiko. Jim Barry came to the Clare region in 1947. He joined the Clare Valley Cooperative as their winemaker. I think he was only the 17th person to have graduated as a winemaker from Roseworthy, so he was almost certainly the first professionally trained winemaker to operate in the Clare Valley. And he was something of a pioneer of table wine production in this region. Now, the family winery wasn't established until 1959, when Jim and his wife Nancy purchased their first vineyard. This was just on the outskirts of the region, and Jim continued working at the cooperative actually up until 1969. Today they own estates mostly in the Clare Valley, but also in Coonawarra. And it's fair to say that they're quite highly regarded both by consumers and critics alike. Now, the Barry family have continued to buy plots throughout the region, and today they have a patchwork of something like about 21 different vineyards, the three principal of which being Armagh, Florita and Lodge Hill. The Armagh is very special. It's got old Shiraz on their own rootstocks, growing in soils that are sandy with a high content of clay. The Florita Vineyard is planted to Riesling. This is an historic vineyard, and there they have some of the oldest vineyards that are planted in the Watervale region. As well as their vineyards in the Clare Valley, they also own the old cricket ground vineyard in Penola, which is near Coonawarra, about 4 or 5 hours drive further south. Now, Jim Barry passed away in 2004, and today the company is managed by one of his sons, Peter. And in fact, Peter is joined in running the company by his children, Tom, Sam and Olivier. And Tom is named, along with somebody else called Ben Marx, as the winemaker on this wine. So to the Lodge Hill Vineyard. It's described as having been a pastoral run, so I'm assuming that's grazing, dating back to 1839, and it was originally named Walter, about 5 kilometres to the east of the township of Clare itself. And Jim purchased the vineyard with the idea of growing some of the best Riesling in Australia. The purchase went ahead in 1977, but actually by 1979 he'd also decided to plant some Shiraz, so they set about doing that as well. And this was a successful decision because the Lodge Hill Shiraz has gone on to win quite a few awards. So this vineyard on the eastern ranges of the Clare Valley has soils that is described as rich, chocolatey loam over almost vertical slabs of rock. And what this rock formation means is that you have cracks or fissures between the rocks, which help to provide good drainage and into which the vines can send their roots in search of water. It's an ideal environment for keeping yields low on Shiraz. Now, the Shiraz plantings here are nestled at the top of the vineyard. They're north facing, and the altitude here is between about 400 and 480 metres above sea level. So these are some of the highest vineyards in the Clare Valley. So the Clare is quite a warm region, north facing, giving good sunlight exposure, but this altitude helps to moderate the temperature and helps the wines retain vitality, energy and freshness. The first release of a dedicated single vineyard Lodge Hill estate Shiraz didn't come about until 2001. So this is 100% estate grown Shiraz from this one Lodge Hill vineyard. Evidently this is machine harvested, and at the winery the fruit is destemmed and it then goes through a careful sorting process, and then the fruit is gently crushed. Now, fermentation takes place in stainless steel vats, and they talk about using heading down boards. So there's wooden boards that are trapped below the surface of the water that stop the cap of skins from rising to the top. So that allows for quite good extraction, which also means that fermentation can go on at a slightly lower temperature, which helps retain some of the aromas of the fruit. Once fermentations are complete, the wine goes into barrel, and there it'll age for 12 months. We're told they use a mixture of new and seasoned oak, but I can't find what proportion those are in. In terms of size, those barrels are a mixture of 300 litre hogsheads and larger 500 litre. And the notes that I've seen suggest that this is a wine that can be aged for another 6 years or so up until 2031. So let's take a look at it, shall we? First of all, the colour. The colour is a relatively dark ruby red. It's a medium to deep intensity. It's certainly not opaque, and there's some purple to maroon hues at the rim. Swirling it, just looking at that, this is a wine that's labelled as 14% alcohol, and I guess it's throwing tears, but it doesn't seem to be too actively doing so. Let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas are rich and ripe. There's a very ripe, dark red fruit note coming through there. It's a ripe plum, a ripe jammy plum, through to almost prune and sultana notes. There's perhaps a little spice behind, but in general it's a juicy, open, ripe fruit that I'm smelling. So let's have a taste. On the palate, that's smooth, rounded, starting to be all enveloping, and then suddenly you get a bitter sort of coffee-ish note that's cutting through this sort of juicy, dark red cherry, black cherry fruit that's there. There's a freshness coming from the acidity that's keeping the wine lively. You're seeing sort of slightly more sort of lifted raspberry notes there on the mid palate as a result of that. And yes, there's sort of, like I say, slight bitter notes of coffee, hints of cedar from the oak, a slightly drying grip. The tannins are actually lovely and smooth. They're quite velvety textured, and there's a chocolatey note, a rounded, rich note. But there is this sort of slightly drying, savoury note of oak coming through there, and at that stage you're getting a little bit of peppery spice as well, just on the back palate. But as I say, there's just that note coming in, adding some savoury notes, and that's just adding an extra dimension to the wine, stopping it from being sort of a one-dimensional rounded fruit bomb. You're actually left with some fairly savoury, slightly earthy notes to the finish, and while you can still see some elegant red fruit, sort of mulberry, raspberry, that sort of quite lively red fruit, there's much more of the sort of savoury, cedary, earthy, slightly meaty notes on the finish. The wine's lasting really quite well. The alcohol's rich and it's full, but the way the structure has overlaid the fruit, it seems to stop it from being too hot, and it seems reasonably well balanced. Flavours last well. There's some nice complexity, and I think there is actually some real Clare Valley character here. There's richness, there's earthiness, there's a bit of spice, but there's the weight and power of a fairly warm, sunny area. Being kept in check by a little bit of grip, a bit of bitterness, and some savoury notes coming through from the oak. So yes, I'm quite impressed by the way that this wine has the power, the richness and the ebullience that you'd expect from a warm climate South Australian wine. At the same time, that note of carefully used French oak, layering it, is managing to give that extra dimension, that structure, that elegance. Really quite impressed with this wine. Looking at the winesearcher aggregated critics score, it gets a 91 out of 100. There might be an argument for suggesting it could get 92, but it's not a wine that goes on to continue delivering complexity. You simply do get the aspects of the rich fruit and the straight savoury structure, so I think 91 is pretty fair. And I certainly wouldn't have a problem with the idea of keeping it for 5 or 6 years, although it's very drinkable in the meantime, of course. So thank you so much for joining us. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have, do please press the like button. We'd really appreciate that. If you'd like to watch more of these tastings, it would be great if you'd consider subscribing to my channel, and that way you can set yourself an alert and you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on. I would really appreciate that fantastic endorsement from you. If you've got any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. It would be great to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I'll leave a link in the notes to the winesearcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's available near you and at what price it is, and also all the background information that's there on those pages that you can use as a resource to investigate the wine further. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope you'll make some time. Come and join me for another tasting in the near future. Till then, bye for now.